The year 2014. The season fall. You turn on Cartoon Network at around 8 p.m. and you see this delightful little guy with a teapot on his head singing about potatoes and molasses. You chuckle and your interest is piqued enough for you to stick around for the next episode. Except this one takes place mainly in a tavern, albeit one where everyone is very keen on musical numbers. People start singing about Highwaymen and the Beast, and since you came in at episode 3, you can't really make heads or tails of it, at least not now. When this happened to me, when I saw this episode, episode 4, little did I know that this episode was probably the most important in the whole series for understanding the plot, themes, and symbolism of the show. It may not be the most important plot-wise or quality-wise, but it basically gives the viewer the keys to understanding what's going on behind the scenes. One might even say, under the surface of the show. It should go without saying that almost as soon as I laid eyes on it 10 years ago, I was enraptured. Not only for its beautiful soundtrack, excellent writing, or masterful animation, but because of something that I couldn't quite put my finger on at the time. The timeless themes conveyed spoke to me in a language beyond mere words. Later on, I would realize it spoke to me in the language of symbols, of allegory, and of myth. Indeed, Over the Garden Wall has deep roots in Western esotericism, psychoanalysis, and comparative mythology. And over the course of the next several minutes, I intend to tell you, dear viewer, how I see Over the Garden Wall. First, a brief update from the future. As I was writing this, I realized that not only do I have much to say for just one video, if I try to put all this in a single video, it could be hours long. It also just makes more sense to split it up into 3 videos based on theme. The 3 main things I will touch on in these videos are tarot, Jungian archetypes, and the hero's journey. This video will focus on how each of the main characters and some of the sub-characters are represented by one of the major arcana of the tarot. Let us begin our journey through the unknown with Wirt. Wirt, I believe, embodies the Fool or Arcana 0 of the tarot. He is our main character, the one we follow for every episode and the character we are meant to see ourselves in. But he is more than a mere vehicle for the audience. He has seemingly a whole life that the viewers are not privy to when we are first introduced. Spoilers for basically the whole series, by the way. This gap in viewer knowledge is represented by his unusual garb. He has on what looks to be a red dunce cap. This, I believe, is a nod to the red ornamentation on the Fool's head in the tarot. Also, both of their cloaks have a red inlay with gold-colored ornamentation on the outside, the flowers on the cloak of the Fool and Wirt's buttons, and both have on a white undershirt. Also on the card we see pictured a white dog. Similarly, we see a mostly white dog in the first episode. Also in this first episode, we catch a glimpse of the recurring theme of water. First, we see Wirt fall into the creek at the end of the fight in the first episode, which mirrors the water on the card. Second, this is also foreshadowing to the twist at the end, that is that they are in the land of the dead from falling in a river in waking life. It is also worth noting here that water, and especially going underwater, is heavily associated with the unconscious in psychoanalysis. Just keep that in the back of your mind for later, and for the next video. On numerous occasions throughout the series, we are told directly that Wirt is adrift. At first figuratively, then literally. Wirt is on a journey of self-discovery, of finding out who he is and who he wants to be, how to overcome obstacles and face his fears, how to enact his will. Likewise, the Fool care is commonly associated with new beginnings or the start of a journey. We can see this reflected in the pose of the Fool, as he is stepping blindly into fate, destined to fall, much in the same way as Wirt and Greg do when they enter the unknown. Now on to Greg, who I believe embodies the Magician or Arcana 2 of the tarot. Also, you'll notice that the order we're introduced to the characters in the show corresponds to the order of the cards in the tarot, Arcana 3 being Beatrice. This pattern sadly breaks down, though, after the first 3, though. Greg's best claim to being the Magician comes from his personality. He is relatively unbothered, and seemingly knows intuitively the right path to take at every turn. Moreover, if you notice, he is the main driver of the plot throughout the majority of the episodes. He had the right idea to make money for the school, he saved Wirt from the dog, he thought to use the bell on Lorna, and he is the main impetus for Wirt to face the beast in the finale. On the card we can see the Magician has one hand raised with a wand and the other pointed down. This is reflected in Greg's pose seen here, and in many other instances throughout the show. But maybe the best textual evidence for this theory is from the last episode where he is collecting the items for the beast. We can see he has wands, stick, pentacles, comb, and cups, cup. But why doesn't he have swords? Swords commonly are associated with the element air in the tarot. Why can't he have air? Because he's underwater. Now on to Beatrice, who I believe embodies the High Priestess, or Arcana 3 of the tarot. In the show, Beatrice acts as a guide for the boys through the unknown, much like her literary counterpart did for Dante in his trip through the underworld. She seemingly knows intuitively where to go, and when asked, she always plays things close to the chest. Likewise, the High Priestess card symbolizes intuition and mystery, but most importantly, the unconscious mind. We can see that both the robes of the High Priestess and Beatrice's bird form are blue, and her dress in the final episode greatly resembles that of the High Priestess. Now onto the Woodsman, whose whole design and vibe just scream hermit to me. We see that both the Woodsman and the hermit are holding lanterns. Both lanterns, on the card and in the show, represent the light of wisdom. In the tarot, it can mean different things depending on the subject, but in the show it represents the light that guides the children on their way back to the known world. We can see that the Woodsman lives alone in his grist mill, and likewise the hermit is conceived of as being alone, much as his name would suggest. We can see that both the hermit and Woodsman have on gray garb. For the hermit it's a cloak, for the Woodsman it's 1800s work clothes. Finally, regarding the overall vibe of the character, the hermit card represents guidance and soul-searching among its other associations. Likewise, we can see in the show the Woodsman acts as a guide for the boys, and is there from the outset to set Wirt on his path to find his true self. Now moving right along to Enoch, the mayor of Pottsfield, who in my eyes pretty obviously represents and is represented by Death or Arcana 13 of the tarot. We can see in the show that Enoch is rather dire and severe. He lays down the law, although not too harshly, with the children, and as they leave he remarks that they will one day join them. Similarly, in the tarot we see death associated with inevitability, as suggested by the armor Death wears in some depictions. This could also correspond to a cat being inside the puppet in the show. Overall, however, death in the tarot symbolizes transition and change. Perhaps the transition into the unknown the boys are undergoing. In the card we can see Death reaping his grim harvest. And similarly in the show we see that Enoch is harvesting skeletons for his dance festival. Another interesting parallel is the cat in the Enoch puppet is riding the puppet much in the same way that Death is riding his pale horse on the card. And lastly, perhaps the most obvious similarity is that Enoch's head looks like a skull. Now in the third episode, sadly, I can't quite pin down what arcana, or even suit in the tarot Miss Langtry represents. Let me know in the comments if you have an idea. But I do think her dad, Mr. Langtry, represents the Emperor card. Not only is it implied Mr. Langtry is the headmaster or at least the patron of the school in episode 3, but in the tarot the Emperor card represents control, stability, authority, and establishment. All traits Mr. Langtry seems to have, if not in spades, at least to some degree. He may not be the most imposing patron, especially without his coat on, but he at least tries to instill some order in the school and secure its funding. On to episode 4 and the Empress, who I believe is represented by the tavern keeper. In the tarot, the Empress is depicted always as a full-figured, motherly type character, representing nurturing and abundance. Not only does the tavern keeper match the physical description of the Empress, but she easily fits the personality description as well. She runs a tavern as her name would suggest, but also worthy of note is that this is the last time in the series the boys can be seen eating food. Real food, not leaves. Yes, they're shown at the table in the next episode, but both boys hardly touch their food. Now we come to the first event instead of character, represented by a major arcana, in the form of the turning point at the end of episode 4, where the boys meet the Woodsman again and erroneously try and subdue him. In chapter 4 near the end, we see that the edelwood tree that the Woodsman was chopping catches ablaze as the children are trying to escape. This scene, at least to me, greatly resembles the Tower card in the tarot. We find out at the end of the episode that the beast is not actually the Woodsman, but instead something altogether much more terrible. Sadly, though, the children don't know this, and instead drastically increase their time wandering in the woods. In chapter 5, we come to the first two characters that are better understood as a pair, Endicott and Marguerite, who I believe are represented by the Sun card and Moon card respectively. The color scheme and lighting in Endicott's mansion is all very bright, and when he and Greg go looking for the ghost, he is shown holding the source of light they use to find their way. In the tarot, the sun represents positivity, happiness, optimism, fun, and warmth. Similarly, we see these traits in Endicott's boisterous personality. Also, the sun is associated with the masculine. Likewise, when Marguerite or her side of the mansion is shown, it's always dimly illumined either by the moon or natural light, often with a bluish hue. Marguerite in the show is shown to be mysterious, ghost-like even. Hence why Quincy believes he is being haunted. Similarly, the moon card is associated with illusions, femininity, and the unconscious mind. This is also a good time to bring up one of the major themes of the show that relates to the tarot. All throughout the show, we see numerous references to the card The Lovers. Quincy and Marguerite, Wirt and Lorna, and of course Wirt and Sarah. Even Wirt and Greg, as strange as it might seem. Bear in mind that the Lovers card only means relationships in the larger sense. Indeed, Aleister Crowley writes, "This is a mystery of the sixth key of the tarot, which ought not to be called the lovers, but the brothers." And indeed, we see that in order for Wirt to start his relationship with Sarah, he must first repair his relationship with Greg. But more than this, he must repair the relationship with himself as well. Numerous times throughout the show he is shown how to love himself, how to be a good brother, how to love in general. But it takes several days in the unknown to really hammer the point home. And as such, we see at the end of the series, Wirt finally comes to appreciate his brother and learns to trust himself and rid himself of self-doubt, which then he uses to pursue Sarah when he makes it out of the unknown. Next, we're on to the second event in the show represented by a major arcana, the riverboat in Chapter 6, which I think is represented by the Chariot card. This may seem shaky at first, but consider just the general visual framing of the boat in the episode. To me at least, the shots where it is shown from the back bear a resemblance to how the Chariot is depicted in the tarot. Bonus. In Crowley's deck, the Chariot's wheels are prominent, just like the wheel's paddles are prominent in the boat in the show. The meaning of the Chariot in the tarot is determination, overcoming obstacles, and ambition. In Episode 6, which is mainly on the boat, we open on our protagonists triumphantly singing about nearly reaching their goal of seeing Adelaide. Additionally, Wirt finally starts to overcome his self-doubt by playing the bassoon in the frog band. And finally, we come to the character that originally stood out to me so much, so greatly resembled his parallel in the tarot, so as to send me down the path that led to me making this video in the first place. I'm talking, of course, of the Beast, who to me clearly is represented by Arcana 15, the Devil. Not only does he have horns and is the main antagonist, but he also is explicitly referred to as the Beast of Eternal Darkness by Adelaide in the show. As we can see on the card, he is served by two witches. These in turn correspond to Adelaide and Auntie Whispers. Luckily, though, in the show, one of them turns out to be good. An argument could also be made that Lorna was the other witch as well. We can see that the devil in the card is holding a torch, while not a lantern. The beast in the show is quite concerned with keeping the lantern lit. This also draws to mind the etymology of the name Lucifer, Luke meaning light and Ifer meaning bringer. Naturally, a bringer of light wouldn't want his light to go out. In the tarot, the devil card represents restriction, attachment, and most importantly, the shadow self. This brings to mind the woodsman's attachment to his daughter that keeps him giving the lantern oil, or how the boys are restricted, unable to exit the unknown until dealing with the beast. We'll say a little more about the beast, but let's save that till the end. The comparisons start to get a little sparse here, just because at this point in the show, we start focusing a lot more on Wirt and his dynamic with Greg and Beatrice. However, one event in the show worthy of note is Episode 8, where Greg wishes on a star, represented by the star card. The only human figure in the card is female, which mirrors how the beast appears to Greg in his vision/dream. The star card represents hope and faith. And in this episode, we see Greg as the only one of the boys not to give up, his faith and hope unbroken by his predicament. Another interesting note is that in this card there is also water, yet another symbol of the unconscious mind, the unknown. Now in Episode 9, strictly speaking, we're not in the esoteric realm per se, that is the unknown. But given how important Sarah is to Wirt, I think it pays trying to pin down what she's represented by. And if I have to wager a guess, I'd say she's represented by the Temperance card. We see both the angel and the Temperance card, and Sarah both have cups/cartons/vessels to carry liquid. This is on top of the fact that both the angel and Sarah are both women. The angel carries two chalices, which could have multiple meanings, Wirt and Greg, Wirt and Sarah, etc. And Sarah has the juice carton with the cups at her graveyard rendezvous. Also shown on the card is a body of water, possibly a parallel to the body of water hidden just off screen, over the literal garden wall in this scene, that the boys fall into to start their whole journey. As for the meaning of the card, the Temperance card is associated with balance, contentment, and peace. All things Wirt needs to find and is striving for throughout the show, much like he is striving for Sarah. At long last, we are at the end of the show, the final confrontation between the beast and our main heroes. an event that I believe is represented by Arcana 20 Judgment. The final showdown Wirt has with the beast can be thought of as a type of judgment. If he does not pass this final test, his soul is forfeit, along with the soul of his brother. Fortunately, he is able to learn from his trials and tribulations in the unknown to outsmart the beast, and in so doing save his soul, his brother's soul, the woodsman's soul, and in theory release the whole unknown from the beast's grip. One interesting thing I notice each time I watch is that the beast never actually physically touches anyone, or at least doesn't do them physical harm. He relies solely on trickery and fear to get the inhabitants of the unknown to do his bidding. Wirt is able to realize this. He realizes the beast has no power that he doesn't give him, and the same goes for the woodsman and everyone else. Because if he did, why would he need so much help? The last thing I'll say on this front is that in the brief glimpse we catch of the beast in the lantern, he is shown to be a composite of faces. To me, these represent all of his past victims. In fact, he might be the collective suffering of all those whose wills failed in the unknown, and who are now wanting people to join them. On the card, the angel Gabriel is shown blowing his horn to signal the end of days, and the dead are shown rising to be judged. Similarly, in the final episode, Wirt and Greg finally leave the land of the dead. One minor note, one could think of the ambulance's sirens as the horns sounding to raise them from the dead. And we've come to the end, the resolution, and a good one at that. And for these reasons, this is where I put Arcana 21, the world. The world card represents ends, resolutions, and the restoration of order. This restoration of order is symbolized by the pan out over the town, but also the revisiting of each character from the unknown, which symbolizes that not only is everything right with the waking world, but everything is set back in order in the symbolic world as well. And there you have it. All of the esoteric associations and arcane parallels my mind could draw while writing this over the course of several weeks. It's been a long time coming. Years, in fact, I just never had the audience until now. And for that, I am truly grateful. I couldn't have made it this far without you all, so as always, thank you for watching. But one last thing before I go, an aperitif for the next video in the series. In all the scenes where the beast is shown, he is always shrouded in shadow. Even in the song in the 4th episode, it starts by casting an ominous shadow on the tavern wall. Not only is this to signify him being an evil or dark entity, but also to signify that his very essence is that of a shadow. Some of you may know what it means already, but all of you will have to wait until the next one to find out for certain. Thanks again and good night. Welcome back to the second video of my mini-series about a mini-series, where today we will be looking at the symbolism and themes in Over the Garden Wall that allude to its connection to Jungian psychology. In the last video, I alluded to something deeper going on, even deeper than the connections to the tarot, something altogether even more mysterious. I left you all on the image of the beast as a shadow, or as a shadowing being, and rest assured, I'll reveal these connections in due time, that is, later in the video. As for the general layout of the video, first we'll do a brief rundown of what Jungian psychoanalysis is, and then we'll dive right into how the show embodies the ideas and concepts from psychoanalysis. But first, a brief digression. Bear with me. If I tell you a joke and you find it funny and laugh, do you choose to find it funny? If I show you a baby and you find it cute, do you choose to find it cute? If you answered no to these questions, that is, answered honestly, then why do you laugh? Why do you smile at a baby? Why do you cry when you're sad? What is the source of all these things? These emotions that we can't seem to know or see the source of. If we don't see a source for them within us, then we must look beyond us. Enter the collective unconscious, that part of our minds that we are not only unaware of, but is shared among many individuals in a society. First recognized by famed psychoanalyst Carl Jung, he could see that it is the source of many of our emotions, and can even contain and convey information. Another of his seminal ideas was that of the archetypes, perennial symbols of psychic forms that recur continually throughout different people, times, and places in history. These are analogous to the forms of the major arcana we talked about in the last episode, except with the 20th century spin. The Senex instead of the hermit, the ruler instead of the emperor, etc. In fact, Jung took inspiration from the tarot when developing the idea of the archetypes. He gave the source, and the reason why these themes and archetypes keep showing up, as the collective unconscious. There are, however, archetypes and themes that he identified that did not come from the tarot, the self and the individuation process being chief among them. The self is the person/subject's whole being, their unification of their conscious and subconscious mind, and individuation is the process by which they unify those two aspects of themselves. It is my belief that in the show, we follow Wirt along his path to individuation. We see him go from a shy, self-doubting, fearful kid to a brave, caring, and self-assured, slightly older kid, if only by a few minutes. Generally speaking, the path to individuation has the subject recognizing their persona, confronting their shadow and uniting with their anima, and thus discovering their true self. There are many more steps and details to this process, but that is the general overview. Before we dive in, consider the metaphor of water that we see recurring in the show. In psychoanalysis, water and going or being underwater is commonly associated with the unconscious, both the personal and collective. You might be familiar with the famous iceberg image, where the tip is the conscious mind, and the portion beneath the water is the unconscious. The water in this metaphor represents the collective unconscious, the water that our mind and the minds of others float and interact in. This, I believe, is one excellent explanation for the unknown, how Wirt views the collective unconscious. And only when he and Greg are under that water can they see the archetypes that inhabit the depths and go on the road to individuation. As we did last time, let's start with our main character, Wirt, or more specifically, Wirt's persona. The persona in Jungian psychology is sort of an extension of Freud's concept of the ego, with the key difference, or rather extension being that the persona is like a mask that is shown to the outside world and to oneself, even to the point where they may not even know they're wearing a mask. Some degree of this, putting on a mask, being false or fake, is needed to simply get around in everyday life, however, and indeed in early childhood this is how the persona develops. For what little good it does, though, it oftentimes causes more problems than it fixes. One can start to forget one's true self beneath the mask and even start to believe that the mask is who they really are. This is why the process of individuation is necessary, to remove the mask and finally reconnect and rediscover who one really is. As for Wirt's persona, we can see he fancies himself the thinking type maybe a little too much. Because as good as being well-spoken and thinking things through is, we can see in the show it rarely does him any favors and often leads to further trouble. As the audience can clearly tell, Wirt is hobbled by low self-esteem and self-doubt. He is given multiple signs by his crush but cannot see or act on them due to his second-guessing. This second-guessing goes so far that he goes to the party where Sarah is at, misses his chance again, then follows them to the graveyard to recover the tape of poetry and clarinet that Greg slipped into her jacket. This rendezvous is then broken up by a cop, and thus we have the impetus that causes his tumble beneath the waves into the unknown. But as for the specific character of his persona, we'll have to look to another archetype, namely the puer aeternus. Far from being the divine child, this archetype represents being stunted, or regression, physically, mentally, or spiritually. Puer is Latin for child, specifically male child. The alternative is puella aeterna, and aeternus is Latin for eternal. And thus we see those that embody this archetype as being childish in the worst ways, being stubborn for its own sake, not committing to anything too strongly, always leading a provisional life, afraid of the possibility of responsibility. In the earlier episodes, we see Wirt has all of these qualities in spades. He deliberately does the opposite of what Beatrice wants just to spite her. He can't commit to a plan to fight the possessed dog, and he can't even work up the courage to go up to the woodsman at first. In analytical psychology, this is a state that people often find themselves in at first, or rather often find themselves stuck in. There is a certain allure to being so completely free from responsibility, of being utterly carefree. But this goes hand in hand with not caring about anything. They are not willing to venture anything of value, and so will gain nothing of value. Now let's look at the counterpart to the puer aeternus, the senex, as he is played by the woodsman. The senex, or wise old man archetype, can be thought of as the opposite of the puer aeternus. While not childish to a fault and willing to accept responsibility, this archetype can tend to be stuck in their ways and resigned to fate, much like how we see the woodsman is in the show. As for his wisdom, when we first see the woodsman in the first chapter, he tells the boys right from the very start what the beast is. He is the death of hope. And even before that, as soon as the boys first talk to him, he tells them, "You're more lost than you realize." But you might be asking, If he is so wise, why doesn't he realize he's being played by the beast? Why does continue to give the lantern oil? Personally, I don't think that he was fooled per se. I think that owing to him being the embodiment of the Senex archetype, that he's too resigned to his fate. He even says himself, "We all have our torch to burn." And while he may know he is being played, he doesn't want to risk his daughter's life either. And now for the other counterpart to the puer aeternus, the divine child as played by Greg. In Jungian psychology, the divine child archetype represents potential, new beginnings, and is a major milestone in the process of individuation. It comes about near the end of the process, usually, and represents the true self about to be discovered. One key aspect to the divine child is that despite facing enormous, overwhelming odds, they find a way to survive, often with the help of others. Think Jesus versus Herod, Moses versus Pharaoh, Heracles versus Hera, etc. And likewise, in the show we see Greg, in spite of his small age and small stature, overcoming most obstacles with relative ease, all save for one. We see at the very end that he is being turned into an edelwood tree, and it is up to Wirt and the others to save him. This can be thought of as Wirt having to fight to save his true self from being consumed by his shadow, and in so doing he draws on the knowledge and wisdom that he has been given by the Senex and from his anima. We now come to the anima, more specifically Wirt's anima as represented by Beatrice. In Jungian psychology, the anima is the feminine part of man, and the animus is the masculine part of women. Traditionally, in the journey of self-discovery, one must reconnect with or discover their anima or animus to find their true self, and thereby reach self-actualization. To me, Beatrice represents Wirt's anima. Not only is she a guiding feminine figure for both boys, especially Wirt, who has more one-on-one scenes with her, she also is on a journey of her own, and suffers from many of the same psychological inhibitions as Wirt does. We also see that to finally defeat the beast and leave the unknown, Wirt must save Beatrice, much like how Beatrice saved him, and her family by turning them human again. This is on top of working with Beatrice to overcome the beast, his shadow, at the very end. One more interesting thing to note. The anima resides almost exclusively in the unconscious, and very often in analytical psychology it is symbolized by water, or going underwater. And thus, only when Wirt and Greg are in the unknown, under the water, can they meet Beatrice. And now finally bringing it back around to the beginning, the beast and the shadow. In all the scenes where he is shown, he is always shrouded in shadow. This harkens back to the song in the 4th chapter I mentioned before. Not only is this to signify him being an evil or dark entity, but also to signify that his very essence is that of a shadow, namely, Wirt's shadow. The shadow can be thought of as the shadow cast by the persona, all those negative traits that come along with masking your true self, an inversion of the persona per se. And just like someone can come to identify with their persona, they can also start to identify with their shadow. Some would even say shadow possession. As for what traits Wirt shares with the beast, we can see that both are smart, or they like to think of themselves that way. Both don't like getting their hands dirty, and most importantly, both have a generally pessimistic/negative outlook. The beast embodies this throughout the show, but this can best be seen in Wirt in Chapter 8, where he laments how long him and Greg have been wandering, even to the point where he starts growing vines on him. But to me, this best typified by Wirt, when in Chapter 9 he sees Sarah pull out his tape in front of Jason Funderburker, and then turns to Greg saying, "That's it," and then hops down over the garden wall. He despairs what he sees so much. He is so despondent over the possibility of them listening to the tape that he willingly chooses to risk death in a certain sense and go into the unknown. Throughout the show, the beast mainly uses fear, manipulation, and intimidation to meet his goals, namely that of breaking the will of the unknown's inhabitants. And this leads me to my next point, the collective shadow. If individuals can have personal shadows in their unconscious, then it should stand to reason that a society could have a collective shadow in the collective unconscious. And it's possible that the beast could be the collective shadow as well. We see on numerous occasions that the boys are not the only target of the beast. In fact, we're told explicitly that most, if not all, the inhabitants of the unknown know the beast, so much so that the beast can sustain itself off of the hopelessness and resignation of the unknown's inhabitants by turning them into edelwood trees, then subsequently to oil. Finally, we come to the end of Wirt's journey of individuation. The self. The self, also sometimes referred to as the true self, can be thought of as the merging of the subject's conscious and unconscious contents. Some say that we are our true selves before we adopt a persona. That is, before we have to interact with society as small children. Personally, I think the self is a little bit more than this, because in becoming one's true self, the subject doesn't revert back to how they were as a baby, but rather incorporates everything that works from their persona, while also bringing to light those parts of themselves they lost in the past. All throughout the show, we see bits and pieces of Wirt's true self poking through. When he plays the bassoon, when agrees to help Lorna, and of course when he sets out to find Greg and defeat the beast. While these are all great character development, what should be noted about all of these is that they are all examples of Wirt self-overcoming, that is, daring to go beyond his comfort zone and break his own limits. This is in stark contrast to how we see him in waking life, how he pines for Sarah and yet cannot bring himself to ask her out. Too afraid to fail, so he's too afraid to try. One could also view this as him being too content with the thought, the possibility of courting Sarah, too happy living in the world he's built for himself in his head. Only when he's forced to inhabit it and escape it that he comes to appreciate reality. We can see that during the final battle with the beast, Wirt internalizes all of the lessons and advice given to him throughout the series, and then has an epiphany right at the moment of his would-be defeat. This, to me, symbolizes Wirt overcoming and moving past his shadow, letting go of all those self-limiting beliefs that impeded him in waking life. Additionally, now when he is back in the land of the living, he has the confidence to ask out Sarah, if only to second-guess himself moments after. Don't worry, the narrator says everything turns out fine. And that does part 2. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas, if this gets out by Christmas. Happy Hanukkah, or any other holiday you celebrate during this time of year. As I said before, I am sincerely grateful for each and every one of you, and I hope you all will join me for the next video. Thanks again, and good night. Welcome back, and I'd like to start our final entry with a callback. If you'll remember all the way back in the first installment of this series, I said that episode 4 was the key to understanding the whole series. More specifically, the tavern portion of said episode. During one's first time watching, it's easy to write this whole sequence off as some playful exposition. But as you come back to it again and again, you start to realize that all the show's themes and motifs are laid bare in these few scenes. We see the tavern keeper briefly going over the idea of archetypes. We have the central question of the show, when the villagers ask Wirt who he is. He waffles around for a bit. The villagers think he is the young lover, which is technically correct but not the whole picture. But eventually they realize that he is a pilgrim, a traveler on a sacred journey, as the butcher puts it. And this is about where it all started to come together for me, because somehow that phrase unlocked something in mind, and suddenly the whole series was put into perspective. As for what that journey is, that would be the hero's journey. In the previous 2 videos, we talked not only about archetypal characters in the series, but about archetypal events as well. A man named Joseph Campbell, a self-taught student of Jung, realized that these events and the order in which they occur can be studied in their own right. He was able to see the patterns that pop up again and again throughout all myths from all of the world's different cultures and societies, and make a science out of studying them. The main product of this study was the hero's journey, the cycle and the patterns that every mythological and literary hero follow. He was also able to see that this cycle is tied to the esoteric journey of the soul and Jung's process of individuation, and that this is the very reason this cycle is so prevalent throughout all the world's myths, to prepare the reader or listener for their own journey. In the general roadmap of the hero's journey, and in much of the scholarship surrounding it, the other world the heroes go to is explicitly called the unknown. It may also be the underworld in some myths, which would also make sense here since the boys are on the brink of death, or the spirit world, or any number of other names. Regardless of what it's called, it is the mythic stage that most of the movement and conflict in the story takes place in. Generally speaking, when Joseph Campbell laid out the general blueprint of the hero's journey, there were a few fixed elements that were present in every iteration. The initial call to adventure, supernatural aid, some sort of guardian meet them, crossing the threshold into the spirit world or mythic world, meeting a mentor of some sort, various challenges the hero must overcome, a descent into the land of the dead or the abyss, some sort of epiphany or revelation, atoning for past grievances, and finally returning to the original world from which they came. And of course, if we look at the show, it follows this blueprint almost to a T. There are a few deviations, yes, but they serve the overall purpose of the plot and themes. Let us begin with the beginning. In the land of the living, we see Greg issues the call to adventure in the form of frog hunting. He says that Wirt promised him, and that he should stay true to his word. Wirt, however, is too busy not talking to Sarah, and instead watching from the sidelines. So Greg, not to be upstaged, takes it upon himself to set Wirt down the path to enlightenment. Here it may seem like a bit of a stretch, but I'm willing to bet that Greg is Wirt's aide here as well. Think about it, he takes it upon himself to aid Wirt not only in setting off the chain of events that will cause him to end up in the unknown, but he also gets him into the party and distracts the graveyard gathering for Wirt as well. As a brief aside, my thinking is that because he stole the rock from the old lady's house, on Halloween night no less, that this is what set forth the rest of the events for the whole series. You can even see the rock at the beginning being taken, and then being put back at the very end, and on to the very start of their journey, the threshold. This one is a little tricky since it's split between the 1st and 9th episode, but from what we can see, it generally follows the same pattern set by the hero's journey. Usually in this stage, the heroes encounter the doorway or portal to the other world, or they encounter an event that makes them flee to the other world. For the boys, this is bungling the encounter at the graveyard and subsequently going over the eponymous garden wall. The name of the graveyard is the Eternal Garden, and dodging the oncoming train. Trains in media and folklore are often symbolic of death, and the song that plays during this sequence even alludes to that. While they might have dodged the train, in their haste they tumbled into the nearby creek and were seemingly knocked out, thus beginning their journey in the unknown. Brief footnote on this one. I think it's very telling that the name of the whole series is a reference to a pivotal stage in the hero's journey. Over the garden wall, going over the threshold into the unknown, etc. To me at least, this just further points to the idea that the creator, Patrick McHale, explicitly had the hero's journey in mind when making the series. And for the next stage, we have encountering their mentor, which is, of course, the woodsman. This ties into his characterization as the wise old man from our previous entry. In other myths and stories, this type of character functions as a guide through the underworld/spirit world and tells the heroes how to navigate this new terrain. He also acts as a mentor, giving the heroes advice on the do's and do-nots of this other world. To return to the woodsman, he meets the boys as soon as they drop into the unknown, and then regularly runs into them throughout the series. He regularly tries to give them advice or help them along as a mentor would, however. Only one of the boys, Greg, is receptive to it. Next, we see the boys receive their supernatural aide/helper in the form of Beatrice. This ties into her characterization as the anima in the last entry. Often in myths and legends, this character comes as a sort of supernatural aid, something that could have only come to them in the world of the supernatural. They also very often have a crucial piece of information, or present some sort of test to the hero, and likewise with Beatrice. While she may be a bit standoffish and taciturn to begin with, she does try to steer the boys in a positive direction, or at least what she thinks is a positive direction. In this case, the crucial piece of information and the test might be one and the same. They seemingly need to get to Adelaide so she can get them out of the woods, the info, while she's actually tricking Beatrice into kidnapping the boys, the test. As for being a helper, she often tries to get Wirt to see the error of his ways and to confront his flaws, in spite of Wirt's best efforts not to, the whole 3rd episode being a prime example of this. We now come to the challenge portion of the cycle. Throughout the first half or so of the series, the boys are faced with various challenges presented by the unknown's inhabitants. Through these, they learn things not just about the unknown and their situation, but also things about themselves. Often in the course of the journey, there are tests, some of which the heroes might fail and some of which they may pass. One of these tests comes in Chapter 4, where the boys notice that Beatrice is missing, and so go look for her in the woods. They find Beatrice likely being helped by the woodsman, but they mistakenly think that he is the one that batted her down. They have a brief altercation with him and then escape as the Edelwood tree burns, and the beast laughs on from the shadows. This would be an example of a test they failed. One example of a test that they didn't fail necessarily, but sort of stumbled their way through, was the encounter with Adelaide. Both boys were tricked by Beatrice into falling into Adelaide's trap, as well as Beatrice too to some extent, although maybe fooled is the right word. Both boys end up totally enveloped by Adelaide's web, and Beatrice is the one in this instance to set things right. This normally would be called the third act low point, but Campbell sees it as sort of like being eaten by a whale, or similarly being in the belly of the beast. Both of the boys and Beatrice, too, have now experienced a brush with failure, and subsequently know what the stakes are now if they fail. After meeting and being tested by a few more of the unknown's inhabitants, we come to the atonement stage in the lead up to the finale. This is the only part of the cycle that's a little out of order, usually coming after the revelation. For Wirt, his atonement comes from his apology to Greg for being a bad brother, blowing him off and blaming him for his own shortcomings. Greg, being the stand-up guy that he is, accepts his apology, only to shortly after seemingly succumb to his treeification. Wirt, having finally taken responsibility, urgently tries to free Greg from the branches before being confronted by the beast. Now we come to the lowest point for both boys, the abyss. This is denoted in the show by the near-complete absence of color during the final encounter with the beast. They are at their lowest, but also deepest point. And just like Dante and his journey, when you're going through hell, the only way out is through. Wirt especially must draw on all that he's learned up to this point in order to thwart the beast and his plans. One thing I think is interesting is that trying to fight the beast physically is presumably impossible. We see the woodsman has tried for hours to chop the beast down to no avail. Only when Wirt realizes he's being tricked do the tables turn. The beast's defeat comes not from physical prowess, but from realizing one's own inner strength, and of course calling the beast's bluff. Which brings us to the revelation. This is the part in the hero's journey where the hero gains a sudden flash of insight, sometimes from a god or supernatural source and sometimes from an internal source. For Wirt, this flash of insight is represented by a distinct ding sound. This is where Wirt's newly acquired wisdom finally kicks in. He finally internalizes all the lessons he's learned throughout his time in the unknown, things he learned from Beatrice, from the woodsman, from Greg, and most importantly, things about himself. All of this culminates with him overpowering the beast with his will, so to speak, and thusly revealing the beast's weakness, that he relies only on fear. With the main evil soundly defeated, we come to the final portion of the journey, the return. This is represented by the boys waking up and exiting the river, the water representing the unconscious and the unknown. The boys, especially Wirt, have finally earned their freedom from the unknown by virtue of their newfound wisdom. And as I mentioned in the last video, Wirt is able to finally use his newfound courage and strength of will to ask out Sarah, even if it will take a little getting used to. This is also the point in the hero's journey where usually the hero shares his hard-fought wisdom with his tribe or village. But funnily enough, it seems Greg is the one doing this, not Wirt. And with that, dear viewers, we close our three-part series on one of my most beloved pieces of media, and without a doubt one of the best animated pieces of all time. An instant classic from the second it came out, if not for all the reasons I've detailed in this series, but just for the fact that it's so expertly crafted. The literary allusions, all the different symbolism, and just the vibe in general. Also, I know it's a little past due for Over the Garden Wall content, but I figured Candlemas, the original release date of this if you're watching in the future, would have to do. And besides, hopefully all of these will gain some traction this upcoming fall. Regardless, if you've stuck around this long, all I can say is still the same thank you that I've been saying since the beginning, except multiplied threefold now. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for watching, and see you again soon.